I'm Rainey Reitman. I'm a writer and a civil liberties advocate, and I am joined today with the incredible Dr. Patrick Ball of HRDAG, Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. I'm the director of research at HRDAG. I've been building databases and conducting statistical analysis, machine learning, and of course, most recently, AI processing on human rights data since about 1991. I work mostly on projects that involve a lot of data. So thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of reported deaths, disappearances, or cases of torture or forced displacement or forced recruitment of minors as child soldiers. In that work, for that work, I've worked in around 35 countries, I think, in about 35 years.
Incredible. So, this is part of a series we're doing called How to Tell the Truth with Statistics, where we unpack complicated or sometimes not so complicated statistical ideas, teach people about them in really straightforward ways, and then maybe pull some lessons out that people can use whenever they come in across data in their day-to-day lives. And I've really been drawn to HRDAG's work because as statisticians, you have such a nuanced, in-depth relationship with the truth. And I've actually learned just so much about it working with you over the last several months, almost a year now, actually, exactly. And today we were going to talk about a particular type of bias called sampling bias. But maybe before we get into all of that, let's just back up a half step. And can you just review what do we talk about with bias data? And I think a lot of people think, oh, if the data is biased, I probably just have to throw that out. Is that how statisticians think about it?
Let's start by asking what's data in the first place.
Oh, there we go.
Um, so we have this idea that there's some world outside of us, and we see the world with our eyes, we hear it with our ears, and we smell it with our noses. We observe the world. And if we build a project and says a bunch of people all together, we observe the world together, and we make some sort of records of our observations, and we collect all these records together, and we'll call that data. A statistician would say that's a sample of data from the world. We don't capture all the possible data in the world. The world is gigantic, and we're just tiny little humans writing things down on computers or scraps of paper. We only get a little piece of whatever we can possibly observe from the world. And so we have the question that we have to confront right away, which is why is this data that we have telling us something useful about the world? Now, useful is doing a lot of work in that statement. But what do we mean by learning about the world? So if I just wander around my little block in my neighborhood and I write down everything that I can see, my sample is only about that block. And I have no business saying that my sample tells me about some other block in some other city or even another block in a different part of my city because I haven't observed any of those things. I've only observed what's on my block. And so the first question a statistician asks is what is the relationship of my data to the world that I want to think about, that I want to reason about? And that's where we confront the problem of bias. In non-technical contexts, in journalism or in law or in any kind of whatever nonfiction writing or even in everyday conversation, we generally use the term bias in the sense of being prejudiced, that we have a prejudgment about some situation. And you say, your data is biased. What we mean is your data comes from your prejudgments of this situation. You're
Mm.
prejudiced. So you didn't collect fair data. You only collected data, all of which might be true, but is highly partial, was cherry picked. You only chose the data that supported your position, and you ignored data that would have perhaps contradicted your prejudgment, your prejudice. So that's what people generally mean when they say something is biased. And that's related to how a statistician uses the term, but it's not quite the same. What a statistician means is that when we say data is biased, we're saying that the data has some systematic difference, some consistent difference from reality. Again,
Mm.
we don't observe the reality directly. We can only observe it through sampling, through a sampling process that generates data. So we did a sample and we got some data. Was this sample representative of the world? Does it tell us about the whole world? Or does it just tell us about a little part of the world? Or does it really just tell us about the person who did the sampling? Does it really just reflect what the sampler was doing. So, for example, if I go out and I only care about dogs and I love dogs and I walk around my block and I write down every dog I see and I don't miss a single dog because I love dogs, but I don't really care at all about cats. Cats are not important to me and I just don't even notice them. And I come back and I say, look at this great sample I have of pets in my neighborhood. You'd
Mm,
say, hey, you only have dogs here. There's no cats. And I said, I got all the pets. That would be biased data because the data was conforming to my prejudgment about the importance of dogs relative to cats. So that's what I would mean. That's the distinction that a statistician brings. The data is, in this case, also biased in a statistical sense because there is a systematic difference between my sample of pets and the reality of pets because I don't have any cats. So that's what we mean. So let's think about this notion of a systematic difference
mm.
in the context of bias rather than prejudice or animus or some kind of political agenda that's somehow hidden underneath this data collection mechanism that we claim to have done.
I think that's a really great distinction. I know we wanted to dig into this issue of sampling bias, and I think
Mhm.
we've started to touch on it. I'd love you to talk maybe a little bit about it, and then maybe also just talk about what are some of the most common reasons that someone might be missing from a data set.
So sampling bias then gets right to the heart of this problem in which we sample the world in order to get data. We have some sort of process, a data generating process, which creates this sample. So we do this. But what is the data generating process and what is its relationship to the world? So most of the data that HRDAG works with is data on mass violence. It's data about, for example, killings. So let's say we're looking at killings in the context of a civil war, and we're trying to assess how many killings there were. So we want to create a list of all the killings. So we start asking everybody we can, hey, who are all the people who've been killed? And we hear all these stories and we may get some photographs and we may do exhumations and review grave sites and try to do humanitarian identification of the human remains in the grave sites to figure out who's dead. How good is our sample? We've got a sample here. Do we have all the deaths?
Mm,
Probably not, and not in a civil war. In a civil war, there are probably more deaths than we're going to be able to capture because some of the deaths will have their bodies completely hidden. They may have been underneath a pile of rubble. They may have been buried by the perpetrators in an effort to conceal the atrocity. All the people who remember those deaths may have fled. They may have run to the capital city, or they may have gone to another country in order to be safe. The deaths may have occurred in a very remote location over a bunch of mountains or in a deep forest that we're unable to access. We don't have perhaps the resources to access. Or it may be that the people who remember the deaths are fearful. They just watched a
mm,
bunch of their relatives be killed. They may have quite reasonable concerns and they may not trust us. They may think, why are you asking all these questions of us after this terrible thing we've just suffered? And they may not want to talk to us. And at the same time, there may be another group of people who are very enthusiastic about talking to us. They may be really committed to having the stories of their loved ones' deaths told by our process. As a consequence, our sample is likely to get all the information about the people in the enthusiastic group, but we'll get relatively little information about the people whose relatives ran away or don't trust us, or people whose bodies were completely concealed by the mechanism of the death, either through burial or concealment by the perpetrators. The bodies may have been burned, whatever the mechanism is. So our sample would therefore be biased. It would be biased, and this is a little bit complex, but it would be biased in favor of the people who had
mm,
easy to capture information and against people, victims who had difficult to capture information. This is very common. And this is not fatal for data. What it means is that we must not interpret the data naively. We
mm.
can't look at the data and think, okay, this data tells us a reflection of the world, which would mean that if we counted up all the deaths by month and we made a graph, the graph tells us the pattern of deaths among the people who were enthusiastic about telling us about the deaths. It
Yeah.
does not tell us about the total pattern of deaths. it's very likely that the people whose relatives were enthusiastic about telling us about their deaths died at different times than the people whose deaths were concealed from us. So as a consequence, if we interpret the graph of deaths by month as though it's true, we will have made a mistake resulting from naive understanding of what data means. The data is useful, but not in a direct way. We have to do something else. And that other thing we have to do is we have to create a formal model for the relationship that our data has to the world. And this is why statistics takes a lot of math.
So you worked in like dozens of countries, you've already said, and I want to pull up just one example that you've shared with me that I found really compelling, which is your experiences in South Africa. Maybe I feel like a lot of people don't really understand the political context of what was happening in South Africa in the 1990s, but you were brought in as part of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'd
Mhm.
love you to talk a little bit about what was going on at the time in South Africa and what was your job when you got there.
So let's set the political stage. In the 1940s, the white government, the government run by white people in South Africa, created a series of laws which disenfranchised Black people. And Black people is a larger category in South Africa than it is in the United States. It means all people who are not white. So it
Mm.
means people who are African, people who are mixed race, and people from South Asia who had been imported to South Africa by the British Empire to do different kinds of jobs in South Africa. So a lot of people from what are now Pakistan and India had been brought to South Africa. So there's these different people from different racial and cultural groups, but all of the people who are not European descended, primarily from the Netherlands and from Britain, all of the people who were not white were excluded from the economy, from jobs, from land ownership, from capital ownership, and forced to live in very specific areas of the country, very poor areas, essentially reservations. This lasted through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and in the 80s, there was constant resistance to it, but the resistance really grew in the 1980s. Until in the middle of the 1980s, the country was almost ungovernable. It was really in a difficult place. And so over the following years, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, finally a deal was reached between the white South African government, the government of apartness, it was called, or apartheid was the formal name for this policy, and the various resistance groups that were demanding change. In 1994, there was finally the leader of one of the biggest groups was released from prison and became president. He was released several years earlier, sorry. Nelson Mandela was released from prison and became president in 1994. And among his first acts as president was to create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was charged with writing a history of the violence
Mm.
and victimization that the apartheid regime had inflicted upon everyone in the country, but specifically Black people.
And
So
can you unpack why a history like that would be useful?
that's a great question. That's a really good question. And what people realized in starting in the 1970s is that when a country transitions from a period of dictatorship or civil war or tremendous violence to a period that everyone hopes is going to be a democratic and peaceful time, one of the things that needs to be done is acknowledge the suffering of the people who were victimized during the dictatorship or civil war. A lot of this understanding and the political thinking around this comes from responses to World War II, in particular, the Holocaust and genocide against Jewish people in Europe, as well as several other ethnic groups in Europe, but particularly against Jewish people. And one of the political responses of Jewish people around the world was never forget, to remember what had happened to them during the Holocaust. So a truth commission or a truth and reconciliation commission is a way of formalizing at a national level a political process in which we never forget, that we remember what was done, often in the name of the state, to different ethnic or political groups in the country. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was composed of 17 eminent civil and political leaders, many of whom were religious leaders, Others were people from the medical and academic communities. Others were former politicians. And these 17 commissioners were charged with writing this history, as well as holding hearings in which victim and political and military groups and leaders were all called to testify about what had happened in the past,
Mm.
and in particular, what they had done or what they had suffered. So that's the big picture. That's what we were doing from about the middle of 1996 until 1999.
And
I
can you
was
talk,
building the databases.
so can you talk a little bit about, because it wasn't just big hearings, right? Were you also getting different types of statements or different types of
Mhm.
data sources? Or what kind of
That's
data
right.
were you collecting?
So the first step of the process is we put out a national call to people to come and give statements to us. And these statements were long interviews, sometimes as long as 3 hours long, in which people told the stories of their suffering. And we recorded the hearing, excuse me, we recorded the statements, and then we coded them out into database records. So we said, here's the deaths that they tell us about, and here's the cases of torture they told us about, and here's the illegal detentions people told
Mm.
us about, and here's the arson cases, and so forth, all the different violent and terrible things that could happen to people. We created database records out of it. Tens and tens of thousands of database records. Ultimately, we interviewed around 21, a little more than 21,000 people.
Wow, that's incredible.
And from all that data, we could start asking questions. What did the people who gave statements to the commission tell us? What were their stories? And we found some things that we did not quite expect. For example, one of the things that I was always struck most by is the age and sex distribution of people who reported being tortured versus the age and sex distribution of the people who reported having their houses burned out by arson. Two different kinds of things. So the people who reported being tortured were, at the time of their victimization, almost all young men, mostly African men. There were some women, and there were some white people, and there were some South Asian people in there, but mostly they were uh, African men in their teens and 20s, even into the
Mm.
30s, but mostly in a specific young men category. Whereas people reporting arson were largely middle-aged and women, also African, but women who were middle-aged. And it took us a while to figure out what that meant. So what that meant is fundamentally that torture was a consequence or the outcome of a process by which the security forces would capture people in public political activities, largely were groups of young men, and then torture them as part of an effort to intimidate them and discourage them from future political participation, torture them horribly, in some cases to death. Whereas the people suffering arson were largely people in these reservation areas who were the heads of household. And these were largely middle-aged women because the men had to travel elsewhere for work. And so they weren't in these reservation areas. They were elsewhere in these kind of barracks and factories and mines and farms where they were compelled to work. But they weren't home. So the person who experienced an arson case was a woman, whereas the person who experienced a torture case was largely a man, and they were of different ages. And I think there's some things that we can learn from statements. But remember the original case we opened up with, which is that data tells us about the process of data collection. It tells us about who told us the stories. It does not necessarily tell us about the world. And so we have to ask, were there a bunch of middle-aged women who got tortured who just didn't report it to us? Now, as far as
Mm.
I can tell, that's not the case. But we can't exclude that possibility with the
Mm.
data we have. And this is a kind of complicated and frustrating reality of capturing information about the social world.
Yeah. So I know that there was a moment when you were in South Africa where you started to wonder about what role bias was playing in your data set. I'd love you to talk a
Yes.
little bit about that. What was your thinking? What ended up happening?
So toward the end of the process, and this would have been, I'm thinking probably in August of 1998, one of the commissioners, a woman named Mary Burton, came to my office and asked how many people had been killed particularly in the conflict between two of the parties of Black Africans. One was the African National Congress, which is the party that rules South Africa mostly to this day. And the other was the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, which was a more regionally based party in the northeastern part of South Africa, part called KwaZulu-Natal. Now, the Inkatha Freedom Party was specifically a kind of ethnic party. They largely came from the Zulu community and represented people almost exclusively of that ethnicity. They also claimed a political lineage that went back to a pre-colonial kingdom of Zulu people. And this is relevant because their identity as a party was really connected to this political lineage. The ANC, the African National Congress, had been founded by Gandhi when Gandhi was in South Africa before he went back to India to create the Indian nonviolence movement that ended, British colonial rule. And the ANC was not ethnically specific in any way. It welcomed people from all of South Africa's many complex ethnicities. And its existence was really founded on the notion of opposing apartheid and demanding equality before the law. So the two parties have these different takes. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, these groups tangled violently. They had violent conflict in these reservation areas, and the violence was
Like
lethal
between the two parties, you mean between
between
these
these
two?
two parties.
Mm,
That's right. Okay. And it was lethal. Tens of
mm,
thousands of people were killed in these conflicts in this from late 1980s until the early 1990s. And the ANC regularly accused the Inkatha Freedom Party of collaborating with or working as an agent of the apartheid government. Inkatha denied this, but if it was confirmed, these relationships were confirmed in the course of the hearings that the commission held. Inkatha argued that the ANC, excuse me, that the Truth Commission was prejudiced against them. They
mm,
rejected the Truth Commission process. They did not want to participate. And so for the first 2 years of the commission's life, Inkatha would have little to do with the commission. In fact, there was only several hearings at which the Inkatha leadership was willing to appear. So this was a big point of tension. And it worried me and it worried other people in the data collection parts of the commission and data organization and analysis groups because we knew that this was a story that was not getting told. We were not hearing from Inkatha supporters. And so we were missing their evidence. And so, in
mm,
some sense, we could watch a bias being created in the data because our data reflected much more richly the experiences of supporters of the ANC than supporters of the Inkatha Freedom Party. And so this was a problem, and I was really worried. Now, what happened is in the very last weeks of the commission's data collection process in, I guess, November and December of 1997, right before we closed the interviews, over 8,000 members of Inkatha showed up and demanded to give us their stories. This created a
mm,
huge crisis in the interview process because there was no way. It took us 2 years to collect 16,000 interviews, and then we had to collect 8,000 in just about 8 weeks. It was just crazy, and it was very difficult to get all that data collected and then processed into the database so that we could use it in the analysis. But we did it. We did it. But this really left me wondering, did we
mm,
get the same level of coverage from the two communities? So when Commissioner Burton came to me, and Mary Burton came to me and said, how many killings were there? I could say, we know about 17,000. This is how many we have documented. And she said, that's not really the question I asked. I didn't ask how many we know about. I asked how many happened. And I couldn't answer. And I couldn't
mm,
answer. I didn't know if we had the right mix of Inkatha or ANC deaths. I didn't know if we had the total population of deaths. All we knew is what we had been told. And so the phrase we used throughout the report that we wrote for the commission, which is 5 volumes long, it's a shelf full of paper,
mm,
is according to statements given to the commission, dot, 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 here's a graph. But this graph represents the experiences of the people who could give us data. We don't know the relationship between this graph and some reality, some graph that could be drawn, because we don't know the full reality. We only have a sample, and we don't have any way statistically to go from this sample to make an estimate or an inference about the whole of murders in South Africa during this period. We had no way to do that. And that was enormously frustrating to me.
Yeah. How did those, that massive influx of additional stories that came in during those last 8 weeks of the commission, how did it change your perception, or did it change your perception of what the violence looked
Wildly.
like? Okay. Yeah.
What became clear is that there was a vastly greater amount of violence committed by ANC activists than we had any evidence of before. The victims of ANC violence only appeared in those last 8 weeks. So we didn't have much information about it. Now, the historians working with us had been researching and studying, and many of them had been journalists, and people knew what was going on, and they knew that our data was partial. They knew that there was a problem. So we were able to triangulate in a qualitative way. In a qualitative way, we could say, well, this data really only tells us part of the story, and we're going to have to fill in the other parts of the story with other ways of knowing. We're going to have to ask from contemporaneous newspaper accounts or from other human rights groups that were working on the ground at the time. We'll have to do this for things. Sure, we could do those things. And those give you a way qualitatively to assess what you've done. But you really want a graph. You're going to want a graph, and you're going to want a graph, and you're going to want to know, how good is the graph? Is this
Mm,
graph precise, or is this graph imprecise? Are these years okay, but these other years uncertain? Where are the issues? And so we needed some statistical techniques that get over sampling bias, that enable us to get through sampling bias and to understand what reality probably looks like, to get us to as good an estimate of probably as we think we can get to. And that's where mathematical statistics comes into play. And that's why South Africa was the last time in my career that I did a huge project with only one data source. Since then,
yeah.
I've used two, three, four, five, and even now in Colombia, we use over 30 data sources. So now we use many different data sources, and we use very complicated statistical models that allow us to answer questions like Commissioner Burton's, how many? But even more
Mm.
importantly, we can answer questions about the distribution of our evidence over time, like in a graph by month, or over space, how many in the north, how many in the south, what is the relative proportions in those two places, by ethnicity, by sex or age of the victims, and so forth. So all of those pieces come into play when we can do proper estimates.
Do you think so? I think one of the things I'm hearing you say is that South Africa was one of these examples where you were able to get in a whole bunch more information by changing your sampling mechanism, changing who was
Right.
able to report, but it didn't completely fix the bias problem you were dealing with. Am I just to put a fine point on it? You still had,
We may have made the problem worse. We
yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
Because what if, hypothetically, and I don't know if this is true or not, but what if before the IFP came to give their data, we had collected half of all the ANC victims,
Hmm.
and we'd collected none of the IFP victims? But then when the IFP comes, and so that's one bias, right? We have a bias. But then the IFP comes and we get all of their victims. Now we have 100% of the IFP victims and 50% of the ANC victims. And let's say further that in reality, there were about twice as many victims from the ANC side as there were from the IFP side. Okay, now let's look at our data. Our data will have the same number for the
Hmm.
two. And we would falsely conclude that the two sides had about the same number of victims. We would have made a different kind of bias mistake. Adding data does not necessarily make bias go away. It may move it around, it may change it, but adding data does not necessarily make bias better. In fact, if you add the wrong data, you can make bias worse. And this is often what we see. It is very common when we do data collection by, for example, media scraping, or we
Hmm.
do data collection by collecting information through SMS messaging. You think you're going to get a lot more data, but you actually just get more of the same data that you already had. And so you get more and more data on urban middle class victims, but you don't necessarily get any more data on rural small farmer victims because media scraping doesn't get them at all. So
Oh,
it doesn't
yeah.
make it any better. Your bias gets worse if you get more data.
All right, so I'm making myself a little note because one of the organizations I co-founded and I'm really involved with, Freedom of the Press Foundation, we maintain a database of all the attacks on journalists in the United States, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, but it's
Hmm.
very reliant on media sources. And I think
Sure.
I need to pick your brain about who could be missing from our data set, that there might be
Hmm.
even more journalists in the U.S. who, for various reasons, aren't represented by media stories. They're not like their attacks are not getting written up.
Right.
Yeah.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
Almost certainly. And so the question that you always ask yourself is, okay, I have the data, right? What do I say?
Yeah.
So I have this data. Do I have all of it? Do I have
Yeah.
every piece of data that could exist in the world? Anyone who's even a little bit honest with themselves will say, no, I don't. I have a lot of it. I don't have all of it. Okay. Is there a systematic difference between the data you do have and the data you don't have? And the answer is almost certainly yes. And the
Mm,
reason is that you have this data. There's a reason you have this data. There's some reason that this data became visible to you. And there's a reason you don't have that other data. There's a reason it was invisible to you. That reason, that structure of visibility that gave rise to some data and hid the other data, that is almost certainly related to the question you're trying to ask of the data. Okay. So when the IFP victims were invisible to us, one of the questions we wanted to ask is, what is the relative victimization of these two parties? The invisibility of the IFP's data is directly related to the question we're trying to answer. And so that invisibility distorted our ability to answer. This is almost always the case. The structure of visibility is almost always related to the socially and politically interesting questions that we want to ask.
mm.
So it's hard. This is not a simple problem. This whole visibility thing takes a lot of thinking. It takes a lot of work to get our heads around and to get statistical methods around that'll enable us to do something useful.
I think that's really insightful. And in particular, this idea that there is a relationship that any data set has to reality and that it's so affected by sampling and like the process we're using, and also that it can have a relationship to like the questions that we're asking of it. Like those fundamental questions are often very much tied to the bias that we're struggling to correct, which I know we're going to talk later, not in this episode, but we're going to really dig into the complexity of how you correct some of this bias using multiple data sources in the future. But it is not a lost cause, I think, is perhaps the
Oh
shorthand of
no,
that. Yeah.
it's not a lost cause, but it takes a lot of math and it takes a lot of reasoning. You have to really
Hmm.
reason about the problem in some sometimes counterintuitive ways.
Interesting. Is there anything else that we didn't hit on that you think we should cover?
I think the thing that I just would like to leave anybody watching this all the way through, I'd like to leave them with this idea to ask, okay, this is the data I have. What's the data I don't have? That's really the question to ask before you make a graph. Before you sit down and you say, okay, I'm going to start learning things from my data. Ask, wait a minute, what am I learning about? Am I learning about the data or am I learning about the world? Those are not the
Mm,
same. Those are not the same. In fact, on if anyone's ever taken a formal class in statistics, probably on the very first day, the professor stood up and said, okay, what we're going to do is this is a class in statistics. What we do is we calculate statistics from data, but we think that statistics are only an estimate of something in the world that we call a parameter. So a statistic represents the parameter in the world. So we can say, in this room, I'm teaching a class, I've got a classroom, and I can say, what's the average age in this classroom? Oh, it's 21. Is that a good estimate of the average age of people in the world? No, because this is a sample of people going to a class who are probably in their late teens and early 20s. Those are the kinds of questions you want to ask. Who's not in the room? People who are not in the room, they may be really different than the people who are in the room. So be careful. Data doesn't get you all the way there.
okay. Thank you, Patrick. This was fantastic. So, people who want to learn more or get the next episode, you can subscribe. You can check out HRDAG.org. You can sign up for our newsletter. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram, we're on Threads. If you have other questions that you want us to tackle in future episodes, just leave a comment and we will try to dedicate some time to it. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you, Rainey.